What if I told you that the most coveted and luxurious garments of the 19th century concealed a deadly chemical and physical threat that no one dared speak of aloud? Behind the glittering windows of expensive fashion salons and elegant ballrooms awash in gold lay a vast and ruthless industry that produced incredibly dangerous everyday garments capable of turning their wearers' lives into a living nightmare. The ideal silhouettes of the Victorian era, which we so admire in old paintings, actually demanded superhuman endurance from women and the constant wearing of heavy, rigid, and chemically unstable structures made of metal, whalebone, and caustic dyes. Every single detail of this opulent gown was designed by fashion architects solely for visual effect, with absolutely no regard for the anatomical features of the human body or basic safety rules. It was an era where aesthetics took precedence over human life, and one had to pay with one's health for the flawless shade of a dress or the perfect curve of the waist. Be sure to watch this video all the way to the end, because today we'll peek beneath the layers of silk and lace to see the shocking underside of Victorian chic. You'll learn how the enormous weight, movement-restricting frames, and incredible bulk of a typical multi-layered dress turned everyday social outings into a grueling test of endurance, bordering on survival. I'll tell you about the hidden dangers that lurked for ladies in the most ordinary living rooms, and why the fashion of that era was truly deadly in the most literal sense of the word. Get ready. This investigation will make you look at the history of costume in a whole new light. Let's begin. A secret passed down from generation to generation was long hidden in huge industrial vats of bright green dye. During the Victorian era, a very rich shade of fabric, known in fashion catalogs as emerald green, gained incredible popularity among high society. This piercing and deep color was created in factories by mixing ordinary copper shavings with a toxic chemical powder based on arsenic salts. The resulting thick dye did not penetrate the fabric fibers at all, but merely settled in a dense layer on the surface of the smooth ballroom silk. With every step the wearer took, tiny green particles broke away from the threads and rose into the air of the enclosed room as an invisible cloud. The process of creating such a complex dress began in dark, damp, and virtually airless dye houses on the remote outskirts of large industrial cities. Workers manually submerged huge, heavy lengths of light-colored fabric into boiling vats containing an incredibly caustic chemical solution of a rich emerald color. After a long dyeing process, the wet material was hung out to dry in special long hangers with very poor natural ventilation. The surface of the silk gradually became covered with a thin crust of dried green powder, which gave the finished fabric its characteristic stiff sheen. The dyed material was then tightly rolled into bales and sent to sewing workshops, where cutters worked for hours with these dusty fabrics. As the emerald fabric was cut, the seamstress's wooden tables quickly became covered with a thick layer of toxic green dust, which fell from every meter of silk. Sharp steel scissors cut through the stiff material, constantly releasing clouds of the dangerous chemical into the workshop air. Seamstresses spent long 12-hour shifts in stuffy, cramped rooms, in constant contact with these harmful industrial compounds. Every voluminous pleat of a fashionable ball gown required meticulous handwork and countless small, precisely measured stitches. The finished garment looked like a true work of sartorial art, shimmering mysteriously under the warm glow of evening gas lamps. The chemical composition of this dye had a devastating effect on the fabric structure, making the silk threads brittle and fragile. In areas of constant friction, especially at the folds of the sleeves and the hem of the skirt, the material quickly thinned and became covered with small tears. Tailors often refused to accept such dresses for alterations or repairs, knowing about the corrosive properties of emerald dust. Scientists of the time regularly published articles on the dangers of such compounds, but fashion magazines continued to promote this shade as the most elegant. Society found itself in a peculiar dilemma between the desire to keep up with the latest style trends and the need to maintain a safe living environment. The popularity of emerald green began to decline only after new synthetic dyes with a more stable structure appeared on the market. Major manufacturers gradually stopped using caustic copper compounds in the textile industry due to intense public pressure. Fashion changed rapidly, and bright green shades gave way to more muted and safer colors in women's wardrobes. The rolls of toxic fabric remaining in warehouses were hastily destroyed or repurposed for use in other, less consumer-facing industrial sectors. The era of toxic ballroom silk came to an end, leaving behind only a few surviving museum exhibits. The surviving examples of these luxurious dresses are kept in major historical museums under special airtight protective glass. Modern conservators work with such unique historical artifacts exclusively in thick protective suits, gloves, and respirators. Even after more than a century, the fabric continues to release harmful substances upon any careless mechanical impact or change in humidity. These dresses serve as a silent reminder of just how dangerous the fashion industry can be in its pursuit of the perfect visual image. Please share your thoughts on this in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. What I am about to show you is strictly prohibited by modern basic safety standards for everyday clothing. In the mid-19th century, the female silhouette underwent radical changes thanks to the invention of the rigid crinoline frame. This complex structure consisted of a cage made of horizontal steel hoops connected by sturdy vertical cotton ribbons. The frame was securely fastened at the waist with a tight belt and flared outwards, creating the shape of a huge dome with a diameter of up to 2 meters. Layered petticoats were worn over this metal framework, concealing the rigid contours of the hoops from prying eyes. The creation of the crinoline was a response to the need to support the ever-increasing volume and enormous weight of women's dresses. Before the advent of steel frames, women had to wear dozens of layers of heavy fabric that restricted their movements and dragged them toward the ground. Paradoxically, the metal structure freed the legs from the weight of the fabric, but in return created a whole new set of spatial challenges. A woman in a crinoline took up an incredible amount of space, becoming a sort of mobile architectural object in the center of any room. Simple everyday actions, such as getting into a carriage or passing through a narrow doorway, turned into a complex logistical challenge. Moving around in this enormous steel bell required special skill and constant awareness of the dimensions of one's clothing. With a careless turn, the rigid hoops could easily knock fragile objects off low tables or tip over small chairs. On windy days on city streets, the wide dome of the crinoline began to act like a real sail, creating strong air resistance. Women had to exert considerable physical effort just to stay on their feet during strong gusts of wind. Managing this unwieldy structure required constant muscle tension and extreme concentration. The steel hoops were highly elastic, which led to very awkward situations when attempting to sit on a sofa or in an armchair. If a woman sat down too abruptly, the front of the crinoline could spring upward, lifting all the layers of her skirts with it. To avoid this embarrassment, one had to slowly and gracefully squeeze the metal hoops with one's hands, carefully distributing them along the edges of the furniture. Manufacturers tried to solve this problem by creating special hinged hoops that could fold at a certain angle. However, even the improved models remained extremely uncomfortable and required great care when handling. In addition to spatial inconveniences, the steel frame created a specific microclimate beneath the dome of the enormous dress. During the cold winter months, the open space beneath the crinoline did not retain heat, causing women to freeze in the biting drafts. To solve this problem, additional warm petticoats and thick knitted woolen stockings were worn under the frame. In the summer, the metal cage provided some ventilation, but the enormous weight of the upper velvet skirts negated this effect. The body was constantly in a state of thermal stress, trying to adapt to these complex structural features of the clothing. The decline of the era of wide steel crinolines began in the late 1860s, when the hoop began to change shape. The volume of the dress gradually shifted backward, transforming into a new rigid structure known as a tournure. Steel rings were now made only in the form of semicircles, supporting heavy cascades of fabric at the back of the skirt. The front of the dress became completely flat, which made walking and moving through the narrow hallways of houses a little easier. However, the general concept of using metal frames to shape the silhouette persisted for several more decades. Despite all its obvious drawbacks, the crinoline left an indelible mark on the history of the textile and metallurgical industries. It became a vivid symbol of an era when form prevailed over function, and appearance was considered more important than comfort. Contemporary designers still occasionally turn to this architectural form when creating theatrical costumes or wedding dresses. Studying these steel cages helps us better understand the mechanics of everyday life in the 19th century. In the next chapter, you'll learn why applying a thick layer of white powder turned the process of removing makeup into a complex chemical procedure. The secret for which people paid a fortune was hidden in inconspicuous porcelain jars on ladies' dressing tables. Victorian beauty standards required upper-class women to have incredibly pale, almost porcelain-like skin. A tan was considered a sign of hard physical labor outdoors and was absolutely unacceptable in aristocratic circles. To achieve the perfect white complexion, women applied a thick layer of a special cosmetic paste to their faces, necks, and décolletage daily. The main active ingredient in this popular lightening mixture was highly toxic lead white, mixed with water or vinegar. This makeup was often prepared at home using recipes from popular women's magazines. The thick lead powder was thoroughly ground in a mortar, with a small amount of liquid added until a smooth, viscous paste formed. The finished paste was applied to the face in a thick layer using special soft brushes or small cloth pads. Once completely dry, the mixture formed a stiff white mask on the face that concealed absolutely all imperfections, freckles, and age spots. Thin blue lines were often drawn over the dried whitewash to mimic translucent veins, emphasizing the illusion of delicate, aristocratic skin. This thick, lead-based mask was incredibly fragile and required extremely careful handling throughout the long social evening. Women had to control their facial expressions, avoiding broad smiles or sudden eyebrow movements, so that the dried layer would not crack deeply. Any display of emotion could ruin the perfect smoothness of the finish, revealing the natural skin tone beneath the layer of white powder. This need to keep the face motionless largely shaped the image of the cold, aloof, and haughty Victorian lady. Makeup literally dictated the rules of behavior in society, transforming living faces into flawless but motionless sculptures. Cosmetics manufacturers were well aware of the toxic properties of their products, but continued to actively market them. The word "safe" was often printed on the beautiful labels of porcelain jars, deliberately misleading gullible female customers. Alternative products based on zinc or rice powder were significantly more expensive and did not provide such a dense, opaque coverage. Demand for cheap and effective lead-based white powder remained consistently high throughout several decades of the 19th century. The chemical industry steadily supplied tons of the dangerous powder to meet the needs of fashion salons and private perfume shops. It was not until the end of the century that the medical community was able to prove a direct link between the use of lead-based cosmetics and deteriorating health. Medical journals began publishing detailed reports on the chemical composition of popular lightening creams and powders. Educational campaigns in newspapers gradually shifted public attitudes toward artificial pallor, encouraging people to appreciate their natural complexion. Manufacturers were forced to overhaul their production processes, replacing heavy metals with safer plant-based or mineral ingredients. The era of heavy lead-based masks came to an end, giving way to light, translucent powders made from talc and zinc oxide. Today, empty jars of lead white can only be found on the shelves of antique shops or in historical exhibits. These elegant porcelain containers with gold monograms hold within them a memory of the cruel beauty standards of the past. Studying the composition of this vintage cosmetic helps modern chemists better understand the evolution of safety standards in the beauty industry. This story serves as an important reminder that visual perfection should never be achieved at the expense of harmful chemical ingredients. Be sure to like this video to support the release of new historical investigations. Want to know the secret that completely altered the anatomical physiology of the human body in pursuit of fashion ideals? The foundation of any 19th century woman's silhouette was a rigid corset that tightly cinched the waist and enforced an upright posture. This complex structure consisted of several layers of incredibly dense cotton fabric, stitched with numerous narrow vertical pockets. Dozens of sturdy, flexible stays, carved from metal, flexible wood, or specially treated natural materials, were inserted into these pockets. At the front, the corset fastened onto a wide steel plate with massive metal hooks, while at the back it was tightly laced with long, sturdy laces. The process of putting on the corset was lengthy and required physical assistance from a maid or close relatives. The woman had to exhale deeply, holding tightly onto the headboard or a special hook on the wall. At that moment, the assistant would pull the laces on the back with tremendous force, bringing the two halves of the rigid frame as close together as possible. The waist was artificially reduced by several dozen centimeters, creating a fashionable hourglass silhouette with unnaturally wide hips. The laces, tied in a tight knot, securely held the structure in place, preventing the panels from separating even under intense tension. Being in such a rigid case completely altered the mechanics of natural breathing and the functioning of internal organs. The steel plate prevented the lungs from expanding downward, forcing the woman to breathe exclusively with the upper part of her chest. This shallow clavicular breathing did not provide the body with sufficient oxygen during even the slightest physical exertion or a brisk walk. Climbing a steep staircase or dancing a lively ballroom dance instantly caused severe shortness of breath, dizziness, and a sudden darkening of vision. The well-known fainting spells of Victorian ladies were not a sign of their excessive emotionality, but a direct consequence of acute oxygen deprivation. The rigid metal boning of the corset exerted constant, intense pressure on the ribs, gradually altering their natural angle. The lower ribs were compressed inward, forming an unnaturally narrow rib cage and distorting the normal positioning of the stomach and liver. The process of eating while wearing a tightly laced corset became an ordeal, as the digestive system had no room to expand. Portions at social dinners were kept to a minimum to avoid severe discomfort and a feeling of fullness in the stomach. Women were forced to eat tiny bites, constantly monitoring their sensations inside the rigid fabric shell. By the early 20th century, the shape of the corset began to undergo significant changes under the influence of new fashion trends. The hourglass silhouette was replaced by the so-called S-curve, which required a fundamentally different design for the rigid frame. The new corset ended below the hips, forcing women to tilt their pelvis backward and thrust their chest far forward. This posture was even more unnatural for the spine and placed a tremendous strain on the muscles of the lumbar region. Lingerie engineering continued to dictate its strict rules, forcing the body to adapt to new geometric ideals. The complete abandonment of rigid frame structures did not occur until decades later, thanks to revolutionary changes in textile manufacturing. The invention of elastic synthetic materials made it possible to create supportive undergarments without the use of heavy steel plates and rigid lacing. The female body was finally able to move freely, breathe deeply, and assume natural physiological postures. Old Victorian corsets took their place in museum display cases as a reminder of a harsh era of strict geometric silhouettes. In the next chapter, you will learn exactly how multi-layered fabric constructions were created to support this monumental historical image. The foundation of any 19th century ball gown or everyday outfit was the use of an incredibly large amount of heavy fabrics. Creating a single dress required between 15 and 25 meters of heavy silk, dense velvet, or stiff brocade. These luxurious fabrics were inherently heavy, placing a tremendous burden on a woman's shoulders and waist. The surface of the skirts was lavishly decorated with voluminous appliques, wide velvet ribbons, glass beads, and heavy metal buttons. All this rich decorative layer added several more kilograms of heavy fabric to the dress's total weight. The total weight of a wealthy Victorian lady's full winter outfit could easily reach 15 kilograms of fabric alone. This enormous mass was evenly distributed across the crinoline frame, but the entire vertical load still fell on the lower back. Constantly carrying such a load led to severe muscle fatigue, back pain, and poor posture. A simple walk through the city park required a woman to exert significant physical effort, comparable to a strenuous workout. She had to take slow, smooth steps so as not to get tangled in the numerous layers of fabric and lose her balance. The dense fabrics were completely airtight, creating an absolutely impenetrable enclosed microclimate beneath the dress. Body heat had no way of escaping, leading to constant overheating even in cool ballrooms. To cool off even a little, women actively used large folding fans, creating localized air currents near their faces. Removing this heavy textile armor at the end of a long evening brought an incredible sense of physical relief. The process of undressing took no less time than dressing, requiring the careful unfastening of hundreds of tiny hooks and buttons. To store these monumental gowns, homes were built with enormous dressing rooms featuring wide, tall wardrobes. It was impossible to simply fold the dresses onto a shelf due to their steel frames and the vast number of rigid decorative elements. They were hung on special sturdy wooden structures shaped to resemble human shoulders and waists. The enormous weight of the fabric often caused the seams at the shoulders to stretch, and the dress would lose its original, perfect shape. Tailors had to regularly reinforce the bodices with additional layers of stiff canvas so that the garment could support its own weight. The Victorian era's love for heavy, multi-layered drapery reflected the general architectural and interior design style of the time. The homes of wealthy townspeople were similarly overloaded with heavy draperies, thick carpets, and massive upholstered wooden furniture. Women's dresses became a visual extension of these interiors, turning the wearer into yet another element of the opulent home setting. The volume and weight of the fabric served as a direct indicator of a family's high social status and financial prosperity. The more elaborate, heavy, and uncomfortable the outfit was, the more prestigious and fashionable it was considered in the eyes of high society. The gradual elimination of excess layers of fabric began only at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Fashion designers began offering lighter fabrics, reducing the number of petticoats and simplifying the complex cuts of evening gowns. Heavy velvet drapery gave way to flowing chiffon, and rigid frames gave way to more natural, soft lines. Bulky textile constructions became a thing of the past, allowing women to finally experience lightness and freedom of movement in their daily lives. Monumental Victorian dresses have gone down in history as an incredible example of how much physical burden a person is capable of bearing in the name of fashion. This is what happens behind the closed doors of luxurious ballrooms, lit by hundreds of open gas jets and wax candles. Evening gowns of the mid-19th century were often made from incredibly light, semi-transparent, and voluminous materials, such as fine muslin or tulle. To create the effect of a floating cloud, dozens of meters of this finest, spiderweb-like cotton fabric were layered over a steel crinoline. Muslin and tulle were highly flammable, igniting instantly upon contact with any spark or open flame. The enormous volume of these skirts significantly increased the radius of the danger zone around every woman dancing in the hall. Sources of open flame were ubiquitous in that era, posing a constant threat to the wearers of voluminous cotton gowns. Ballrooms were lit by chandeliers with thousands of candles, from which hot wax regularly dripped and smoldering wicks sometimes fell. The spacious rooms were heated by large open fireplaces, around which guests gathered for social conversation. Sparks from burning logs often flew onto the carpets, landing directly on the delicate layers of tulle skirts worn by the ladies standing nearby. Street lamps and gas lamps in the hallways also lacked reliable protective glass shades, posing a serious threat. The steel frame of the crinoline paradoxically intensified the flames in the event of a fire starting in the lightweight fabric. The hoops held the burning material at a certain distance from the legs, creating ideal draft for the flow of fresh oxygen to the source of the fire. The design functioned like a classic chimney, forcing the flames to rise rapidly upward, engulfing ever-new layers of dry fabric. The fire spread throughout the dress in a matter of seconds, turning the luxurious gown into a massive blazing bonfire. It was incredibly difficult to extinguish such a fierce flame due to the large number of rigid metal hoops, which prevented the fabric from being pressed tightly against the body. In addition to ballrooms, the narrow theater wings and cramped dressing rooms of ballet dancers posed a huge danger. Stage costumes made of light tulle often brushed against open gas spotlights, illuminating the stage from below and from the sides. The theater environment was considered one of the most dangerous places to wear multi-layered tulle skirts with a rigid metal frame. Theater owners were forced to hire special fire guards who stood behind the scenes with wet blankets during every performance. But even such strict precautions could not completely rule out the sudden ignition of fluttering theatrical fabrics. The development of safe electric lighting systems in the late 19th century significantly reduced the risk of flamboyant costumes catching fire. The advent of enclosed incandescent lamps made it possible to remove open flames from ballrooms, corridors, and theater stages. Electric light became a true lifesaver for fashionistas, allowing them to wear airy clouds of tulle and muslin without fear. Nevertheless, open fireplaces in living rooms still remained a local source of danger in the home. The skill of safely navigating past fireplace grates remained an essential part of any society girl's upbringing. Changes in fashion silhouettes also helped reduce the number of incidents involving burning evening gowns. The wide-domed crinolines were replaced by narrower dresses that hugged the figure tightly and lacked the vast number of light ruffles. The fabrics became heavier and denser, which significantly reduced the speed at which flames spread upon contact with fire. Gradually, the era of flaming ball gowns faded into the past, leaving behind only grim newspaper reports. In the next chapter, you will learn what chemical compounds were used to secure the enormous hats to the elaborate hairstyles of the time. Creating a complete high society look was unthinkable without an elaborate headpiece that completed the vertical line of the silhouette. Victorian hats were massive structures made of thick felt, heavy velvet, stiff silk ribbons, and voluminous decorative arrangements. The very process of manufacturing felt bases posed a serious chemical hazard to the workers who processed the material in factories. To soften and shape the dense fibers, toxic mercury nitrate was used extensively, which actively evaporated in the hot air of the workshops. Hat makers spent long hours in unventilated rooms, constantly inhaling these extremely toxic chemical compounds. Although dried felt posed less of a chemical threat to the owners of the finished hats, the weight of the structure itself created enormous physical challenges. Bulky hats, adorned with meters of thick ribbon and metal buckles, could weigh several kilograms. This heavy velvet dome had to be securely fastened atop a complex, towering hairstyle made of one's own hair and hairpieces. The slightest gust of wind on the street or a sudden tilt of the head could upset the balance and send the heavy structure crashing to the ground. To solve this problem, an entire system of rigid fasteners using long metal rods was developed. The main fastening tools were sharp hat pins, forged from durable steel and adorned with massive decorative finials. These metal pins could reach up to 30 centimeters in length, turning them into veritable steel stilettos. A woman would pierce the rigid frame of the hat with a pin, then thread it through a tight bun of hair at the crown and pull the tip out through the felt on the other side. For reliability, 2 to 4 such long rods were used, which firmly secured the heavy headdress to the hairstyle. This process required tremendous precision, as the slightest mistake could result in a serious injury to the scalp. The process of removing the hat upon returning home was a true ritual, requiring time and the utmost care in front of the mirror. A maid or the lady herself had to carefully feel for the heads of the pins in the thick folds of velvet and slowly pull the steel pins out of her hair. Once all the fasteners had been removed, the heavy felt dome was lifted off, revealing a hairstyle flattened and tangled by the stiff rods. The scalp, trapped beneath the heavy, non-breathable fabric, was often covered in irritation from constant friction and lack of ventilation. The relief of removing this burden was comparable only to the moment of unlacing a tight evening corset. Hat pin manufacturers competed to create ever more luxurious and expensive decorative finials for their products. The heads were adorned with large glass, enamel, carved bone, and even precious metals imitating intricate patterns. This accessory became an important element of a woman's jewelry collection, emphasizing her overall status and wealth. Long steel pins were often kept in special, elegant stands on dressing tables, resembling a peculiar arsenal of exquisite weapons. Their functional harshness was concealed behind an incredibly beautiful and glittering exterior. With the dawn of the 20th century, the fashion for huge, heavy hats began to gradually fade into the past under the influence of a new pace of life. Women began to lead more active lifestyles, driving cars and participating in sports, which required more practical headwear. Huge felt structures were replaced by compact cloche hats, which fit snugly on the head and did not require rigid metal fastenings. Long, sharp pins lost their practical necessity and quickly disappeared from the daily lives of city women. Steel stilettos remained only in antique collections as a striking example of how beauty literally demanded dangerous engineering solutions. The foundation for maintaining perfect posture and the entire multi-layered structure of the dress was the incredibly tight and rigid Victorian footwear. Fashion standards dictated the need for a tiny, narrow foot that was supposed to peek gracefully from beneath the hem of a long skirt. To achieve this ideal, master shoemakers created boots and shoes that did not correspond at all to the actual anatomical width of the human foot. Leather boots were sewn on perfectly symmetrical lasts without distinction between the left and right foot, which put enormous pressure on the toes. The process of breaking in such shoes took many months and turned every step on the street into a difficult ordeal. The material used to make women's boots was very thick, poorly tanned leather or stiff fabric on a dense lining. High lacing or a row of tight metal buttons tightly secured the ankle joint, completely depriving it of its natural mobility. The gait became small, shuffling, and unnaturally stiff, as the foot could not roll normally from heel to toe. This restriction of mobility went hand in hand with heavy crinolines, preventing women from taking wide or sudden steps. A stiff leather corset for the legs complemented the fabric corset at the waist, creating a sensation of complete physical immobilization of the body. A high and very thin heel, shifted toward the center of the foot, radically altered the body's natural center of gravity. Women were forced to constantly balance, shifting the entire weight of the enormous dress and the steel frame onto the front of the foot. This led to severe bone deformation, toe curvature, and the formation of painful lumps on the joints. Constant strain on the calf muscles caused chronic cramps and severe swelling of the ankles by the end of each day. The ability to stand for long periods at social gatherings in such shoes required incredible physical endurance and a tolerance for discomfort. The 19th century shoe industry completely ignored the emerging orthopedic knowledge regarding the structure of the human skeleton. Factories churned out millions of pairs of perfectly symmetrical and rigid shoes, guided solely by fashion sketches from magazines. Doctors regularly published articles on the dangers of tight shoes, linking them to poor posture and circulation problems in the lower limbs. However, the desire to have a visually small foot was so strong that women continued to ignore any medical warnings. Deformed feet became as much a silent symbol of the era as unnaturally narrow waists and pale faces. It was not until the end of the century that the first models of women's shoes appeared that took into account the difference between the left and right feet. Lasts became more anatomically shaped, and upper materials, softer and more pliable for comfortable wear. The widespread adoption of bicycles and the emergence of women's sports prompted manufacturers to create practical boots with low, stable heels. Lacing became more convenient, allowing women to put on and adjust the fit of their shoes independently without the help of maids. This was an important step toward liberating the female body from the rigid constraints of Victorian fashion. Today, the symmetrical, narrow boots of the 19th century look like sophisticated instruments of torture in museum display cases. Studying these antique shoes helps us understand just how radically our ideas about physical comfort and health have changed. The modern footwear industry prioritizes ergonomics, leaving the concept of beauty through rigid confinement firmly in the past. Victorian shoes serve as a vivid reminder that the architecture of clothing must conform to human anatomy, not the other way around. In the mid-19th century, the textile industry underwent a veritable revolution thanks to the accidental discovery of synthetic dyes. The first chemical dye, known as mauvine or aniline purple, caused a sensation in the fashion market. This vivid purple hue, derived from coal tar, was much cheaper and brighter than traditional natural dyes. Soon, laboratories began producing a whole palette of unprecedented synthetic colors, piercing fuchsia, acid magenta, and bright blue. Factories switched en masse to using these cheap chemicals, completely ignoring their unstable chemical nature. The production process for these dyes turned entire industrial districts into high-risk chemical zones for workers. Open vats of boiling aniline mixture emitted thick, toxic fumes that permeated the walls of the workshops and the workers' clothing. The technology for fixing synthetic dyes to fabric required the use of caustic acids and heavy metal salts. The finished silk or velvet coming out of such factories often retained a pungent chemical odor that lingered for months. The material was sent to sewing workshops, where cutters were the first to encounter the aggressive properties of the new fashionable shades. Unlike older natural dyes, early aniline pigments had extremely poor resistance to moisture and friction. At the slightest contact with human sweat, the acidic colors began to bleed actively, transferring the chemical dye directly onto the skin. Women wearing bright purple or fuchsia dresses often discovered deeply ingrained colored stains on their necks and arms by evening. These chemical stains could not be washed off with ordinary soap. They remained on the body for several days, causing severe irritation. Toxic dye molecules penetrated the pores of the skin, posing a constant hidden threat to the wearer's health. The discharge of industrial waste from aniline factories caused colossal damage to the ecology of rivers in major European textile centers. The water in the canals was often dyed a piercing crimson or violet color, poisoning all living things for many kilometers around. This environmental catastrophe was a direct consequence of society's insatiable thirst for ever brighter and cheaper fabrics. The luxurious fuchsia dresses at high society balls were merely a beautiful facade for a massive and incredibly dirty chemical industry. The beauty of the Victorian era was literally built on the use of destructive technologies, the consequences of which were hidden for a long time. By the end of the 19th century, chemists had managed to refine the formulas for synthetic dyes, making them more durable and safer for the skin. The processes for fixing pigment to textile fibers became more sophisticated, preventing the dangerous migration of color onto the human body. Aniline purple gave way to new generations of industrial dyes that no longer cause such widespread skin reactions. Regulation of chemical production gradually became the norm, limiting the use of the most dangerous caustic compounds in the textile industry. The era of uncontrolled use of a toxic acid palette is now a thing of the past, marking the first encounter between fashion and synthetic chemistry. The finishing touch to a monumental Victorian gown was often a long train, which trailed heavily behind the wearer. This piece of heavy silk or velvet could reach several meters in length, sweeping across the floor of the ballroom. While the train looked majestic in clean home interiors, on city streets it turned into a veritable logistical disaster. The cobblestone sidewalks of the 19th century were covered with a thick layer of soot from factory chimneys, coal dust, and street grime. The expensive fabric acted like a giant broom, collecting all this city grime with every step. To keep the hem of their dresses relatively clean, women had to master the complex technique of lifting their heavy skirts by hand. When crossing the street, a lady had to carefully gather meters of fabric with one hand, exposing several petticoats and the tops of her boots. This process required considerable physical strength, as the weight of the velvet and the stiff frame pulled the arm downward. In rainy weather, the heavy, wet train became practically impossible to lift, turning a walk into an exhausting physical test of endurance. Special clips and chains for lifting the trains, known as pages, only slightly eased this arduous daily task. Bringing street dirt into the living quarters on long trains created serious problems for maintaining the cleanliness of the home. The dark velvet hems of the dresses left a dirty, wet trail on the expensive, light-colored carpets and parquet floors of the living rooms. Maids had to clean the floors immediately after each of their mistresses walks outside to prevent soot from seeping into the floor coverings. The dresses themselves required daily, lengthy, and thorough dry cleaning with brushes to remove caked-on city grime. This continuous cycle of soiling and cleaning made wearing fashionable long gowns incredibly labor-intensive and expensive. Heavy trains posed a serious physical hazard on staircases and in the cramped spaces of public buildings. A long piece of fabric trailing behind could easily get caught under the feet of people walking behind, causing dangerous falls. When descending stairs, a woman had to drape the entire train over her bent arm, completely throwing off her balance. Accidentally stepping on the hem of a heavy dress often led to ankle injuries and falls from the height of the steps. Moving through a crowd with a trailing train was not only inconvenient, but also irresponsible toward surrounding pedestrians. Today, voluminous dresses with trains can only be seen on red carpets or in historical films. Studying the mechanics of these outfits reveals just how much physical labor was required simply to maintain a neat appearance in the 19th century. This story reminds us of how strongly urban architecture and fashion influence people's everyday comfort. Heavy velvet trains are a thing of the past, serving as yet another example of a beautiful but incredibly impractical design choice. We have examined in detail only a small fraction of the hidden engineering and chemical challenges that accompanied the creation of luxurious Victorian attire. Behind every perfect fold of fabric, every delicate silhouette, and every vibrant color lay a whole system of physical and technological hazards. These historical examples clearly demonstrate that the fashion industry of the past often achieved visual perfection at the cost of incredible discomfort and dangerous compromises. 19th century beauty was monumental, heavy, and demanded phenomenal endurance from the wearer to maintain it on a daily basis. What modern wardrobe items do you think might seem just as dangerous or absurd to people in the future? Suggest topics for our future historical videos that you'd like to see in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel.